Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education presented by Tom Breeze. A National Plan for Music Education with Dr Viv John and Dr Elizabeth MacGregor. Hello and welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, where I am in some ways podcasting solo. Emma's not here, Sian Wickesham's not here, but friend of the podcast, Dr Viv John, is here.
Hello, and nice to be back, and nice to be in this room. I've never been here before.
No, we used to have to build our own studios back in your tent, didn't we, Viv? So Viv is here to co-produce, present, discuss this episode with me, but so is another guest who is rapidly attaining podcast fixture status, I think. Dr Elizabeth MacGregor is joining us from Oxford and is on our enormous screen. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello. What a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, we can see you for the first time in the podcast.
I think we should introduce Walnut as well.
Yes.
And Walnut.
Yeah.
If you're watching, this black cushion
He
is actually
alive.
a dog.
It wouldn't be the same without him, Elizabeth, so I'm glad he's here.
Yes.
Yep.
Walnut joins us for all our research work meetings.
He's the brains of the outfit.
That is definitely the brains of the outfit. So if you're one of our small but dedicated band of YouTube viewers, you can see both Elizabeth and Walnut on our big studio screen. And today we're here to discuss some work that we've been doing in relation to the National Plan for Music Education, which is a thing in England, but also a thing in Wales, Viv.
Yeah, it is. So we've recently published an article where we undertook a comparative analysis of the two music plans from England and Wales. They both bear the same name. They were both published in the same year. The English policy was a long-awaited update from a similar policy that was published, I think, maybe 10 years or so previously. But the Welsh one is brand new. There's never been anything like it before in Wales. So, but of course, it comes at a time in Wales where we're experiencing, pretty seismic educational reform. So I guess it's part of that reform agenda. As we looked at the two plans, of course, we saw some similarities, but we saw quite a lot of differences, and we saw quite a lot of kind of talking points and tensions that we really wanted to get our teeth into and illuminate. So what we're going to do, I think, today is, first of all, Elizabeth and I will give a very brief overview of the sort of historical contexts of the two countries leading up to the point of these national plans. Then we're going to introduce you to an analytical approach by Carol Backey. Tom's going to talk us through it, called What's the Problem Represented to Be? And we're going to use that then as a tool to critically analyse and to compare the two policies. And then briefly, we're going to just speculate on maybe some of the missed opportunities, the potential ways forward for these plans, as we think about music education in our countries moving forward, maybe some suggestions and potential ways that things that they can think about.
Yeah, so before you all switch off thinking, here's another arts education episode, there is another angle, isn't there? This policy analysis angle, which we think might be of interest to a wider range of viewers and listeners. Yeah, so we're using the policy analysis, but we're looking at these two national plans for music education. So, Elizabeth, you know more about England than we do because you're over there in Oxford at the moment. So I think you're going to kind of set the scene for us from over the border.
Yes. What a privilege to be here in
to
England.
Be over the border.
Indeed. So let me take you right back to the 1990s to begin with, which is when the national curriculum across all subjects was first introduced. And it's worth saying here that in music, the national curriculum was kind of divided into two areas, if you like. The first was related to the practical aspects of composing and performing, and the second was related to, more cognitive aspects of appraising and listening. However, although all four of these different skills were involved in the national curriculum, there was actually no requirement for pupils to learn to sing or play an instrument as part of their school education. But as the national curriculum was introduced, various educationalists and teachers and practitioners started to suggest that this might be a good idea. After all, it's quite an important part of learning music. So come 2001, was when the government first committed to the idea that they would like to be able to offer every child at primary school who wants to the opportunity to learn a musical instrument. Now, this became known as the Wider Opportunities Pledge, and it resulted in something called the Wider Opportunities Pilot Programme, which was where some regions in the country started rolling out this whole class instrumental teaching structure. So you'd get a whole class of 7-year-olds all learning the violin for a term, for example. They also rolled out a national singing plan called Sing Up, and these programmes sort of happened in isolated areas of the country, testing whether this was a feasible thing to introduce predominantly into primary music education. However, people like the Schools Inspectorate Ofsted reflected by around 2011, 2012 that these programmes, although they had been effective where they had been introduced, they had not been sort of sufficiently impactful to change the music education ecology across the country. So that is what preempted the first national plan for music education in England. This was introduced in 2011, and it effectively had 3 major impacts on the way that music education was conceived in the country. First of all, it rolled out that Wider Opportunities programme across the whole country, giving, in effect, every primary school child the opportunity to learn an instrument. Second, it introduced the notion of music hubs. That's basically a new name for what had previously been local authority music services. So these became music hubs, and they were the places where lots of extracurricular activities were offered or curricular support for music was offered to schools. And finally, there was an emphasis on offering progression routes. So for the most exceptional young people playing music, they could go to specialist music schools, specialist dance schools, play in national youth ensembles, for example. This came in 2011, and initially it was a 10-year plan. There was an expectation that it would be updated in 2021. Evidently, something called COVID-19 got in the way of that.
Busy.
Yes. All the policymakers were busy doing different things. But by 2021, it was widely reported that despite the kinds of initiatives that had been brought in by the national plan, music education wasn't looking particularly healthy. And in fact, numbers were still dropping and uptake was declining, especially as increasing emphasis was put on foundation subjects catching up from the pandemic. So when it finally came in, the 2022 update to the National Plan for Music Education caught people a little bit off guard. It was a bit of a surprise. People didn't know when the update was going to be released. And in many regards, it mirrored the Wider Opportunities Pledge that had been enacted by the 2011 version. But it also undertook some major restructuring. It reduced the number of hubs from 118 to just 43 hub lead organisations. And it introduced other things like different pathways for progression, different centres of excellence. And invigorated this slightly different image of music education, which is what we're going to explore as we talk now. But I think, Viv, tell us about the Welsh National Plan and where that came from.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So, like England, the Education Act of 1988 brought about the introduction of the first national curriculum here in Wales. It's interesting, Elizabeth, that you talked about in England separating performing and composing and then appraising and listening, because, of course, in Wales, we had one attainment target, which was music. And performing and composing and appraising was one kind of holistic model, as Keith Swanwick envisaged, that it should be. And so when it was introduced, it came in really without much debate and with actually very little prescription. And it set the path in Wales for, in classroom music at least, for what became a highly practical, skills-based music curriculum. And being a young teacher at the time myself, back in the late 80s, it was really exciting to have what was then quite an innovative, diverse and sort of, really inclusive national curriculum for music. Alongside the new national curriculum sat the music services, and they augmented classroom learning. Peripatetic musicians visited schools and provided individual and group tuition. And also the music services were responsible for the county music ensembles, such as orchestras, bands, choirs, etc. And back at that time, so we're talking maybe late 80s into the early 90s, that provision was fairly standard and fairly consistent across all 8 counties of Wales. But when in 1996, those 8 counties were broken up into 22 unitary authorities, the music services and the work that they did unfortunately began to fragment, and it culminated in what became quite a variation across Wales in terms of the size of each music service, the provision they offered, and of course the funding model as well. Devolution came along in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, and in terms of music provision, there was another review in 1999. Welsh Government pledged to offer all young people in Wales a broad range of high-quality musical experiences. They also gave music services an £8 million music development fund. And at the time, this was a sort of great hope for music education, particularly extracurricular music education provided by music services. But unfortunately, despite those the funding, despite those pledges, music service provision remained inequitable across Wales. And one music advisor at the time described it as an economic and geographical lottery. And this prompted Welsh Government in the early 2000s to create a task and finish group to investigate, the deep-seated issues in music service education. And they came up with several recommendations, particularly around improving consistency, standardisation of provision. They wanted more collaboration across music services in Wales. And at the time, I remember, there were some minor moves strategically, to try and make that happen. But unfortunately, on the ground, there was, very little impact, and that variation continued. And then things got even more interesting, because in 2018, a Welsh Government committee called the Culture, Welsh Language and Communications Committee published what turned out to be quite an influential and maybe infamous, I don't know.
Interesting. All the I words.
Yeah, interesting. Let's just stick with interesting. An interesting report called Hitting the Right Note. And although it was really clear, when you read the report, it's really clear that they were focusing on the work of the music services. Throughout the report, they consistently and continually kept on using the broad term of music education, when clearly they were referring purely to extracurricular provision of the music services. And in doing so, they began, unfortunately, a sort of a path where they narrowed the scope of what constituted music education in Wales, because it became only something about the music services. And unfortunately, this problem then perpetuated as we went through, into more recent years. Then there was at the same time, of course, we had Donaldson, who reviewed education in Wales. He'd written Successful Futures. Welsh Government has accepted all his recommendations. Pioneer Schools had been tasked with creating curriculum for Wales. And in the spirit of subsidiarity, teachers across Wales were beginning to design their own curricula that was bespoke to their learners and their contexts. But in terms of music, yet another feasibility study into music service provision was completed in 2020. And strangely, it proposed the introduction of these one-off musical experiences provided by music service teachers in the classroom, particularly in primary schools. Now, we're going to talk quite a lot about this as we go through the analysis, so I won't go too much into it. But maybe just to say that it was a little bit of a strange thing to do, given that Curriculum for Wales was all about subsidiarity and giving agency to classroom teachers to design their own curricula. It was a bit of a kind of a curveball, really, but more of that later on. Then eventually we get to the National Plan for Music Education, which was published in 2022. It stated that its purpose was to deliver our commitment to establish a national music service for Wales. And, to be fair to the policymakers, in terms of that national music service bit, it has done that quite successfully and it has achieved quite a lot. When we think back to that task and finish group in the early 2000s, a lot of what they were asking for, this plan has already done. There is more consistency and standardisation across Wales in terms of music service provision. There is definitely more collaboration and there seems to be more equality in terms of funding as well. So, they have achieved quite a lot in a short space of time, which is to be commended. But at the same time, the plan set out a more widely framed vision for music education in Wales. And it talked about all young people experiencing the joy of music in all its forms, in every school setting across Wales. And it was a bit confusing because, again, it seemed to perpetuate this sort of conflation of what music services education was and what music education more widely across Wales was. And this is a theme that we're going to pick up as we go through the analysis. But that gives you a potted history, really, of the Welsh scene to date.
Yeah, so there we go. For anyone who's not been paying attention, because maybe you're not a music person, or maybe you've only started teaching recently, or maybe you're listening and you haven't become a teacher yet at all, that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the backstory in Wales and England. It's really important to kind of get this idea that music education in Wales and England has never been the same, even though we were bound by the national curriculum for most subjects in the same way pre-devolution in 1999. Actually, music has always been different. Wales always went its own way. We've always kind of headed off in our own direction since devolution as well in terms of education policy. So how interesting it is that just by almost coincidence, I suppose, both countries happened to produce a national plan for music education in the same year. It just seemed like a fertile opportunity to put them next to each other and really dig into them. And the policy analysis framework that we used for this is something that Elizabeth was kind enough to introduce us to, is this idea called What's the Problem Represented to Be, which is the work of Carol Backey. And she uses it as a sort of critical way to almost reverse engineer policy documents. So it's I suppose tempting, if you don't think about things too much, to assume that if there's a problem, that problem is just a thing that exists in and of itself. There's no sort of contesting of that problem, and then the government's job is to decide how they're going to fix that problem. But Backey looks at it in a slightly more sceptical, I suppose, or critical way, and encourages us all to almost go backwards from the policy. And what she's suggesting is that actually these policies, they don't solve a problem that exists outside of that policy. It sort of constructs the problem in a way that governments find is politically useful, and then sort of shapes that narrative from that way. And I mean, an example of that is her work where she looked at the national curriculum itself. Viv talked about the Education Reform Act bringing the national curriculum. It came in the early 90s. And Backey's done some work which suggests that was all about setting up, constructing a problem which appeared to be self-evident, which was that they needed to have a lot more, then education needed to have a lot more oversight and standardisation from the government. So just producing that national curriculum sort of frames, almost makes it an assumption that this is a problem that needs to be solved. And so what she does in this framework is she asks us 6 questions. First of all, encourages us to look at what the problem is represented to be by this policy. What are they saying the problem is? Let's not assume that it is. What are they saying that problem is? Then she asks us, what presuppositions or assumptions underlie that representation of the problem? I mean, Viv's given us a few kind of pointers towards what we're going to be talking about over here in Wales about assumptions and presuppositions, or even conflations. How has the problem representation come about? So what is the process by which government or policymakers have arrived at this representation of a problem, or have constructed this problem, which they're then going to conveniently solve with their policy? Moving on from that then, she encourages us to be a little bit critical about this representation. So the fourth question she asks is, well, what does this representation leave unproblematic, or what does it silence? What's kind of left on the outside of this discussion about a problem? What's kind of silenced by it? The fifth question that she asks is basically, what are the lived effects of this problem-solving policy on the people who are on the receiving end of it? And of course, in our case, that would be music teachers, people working in the music education field in all its guises, and also the pupils. What is the actual impact on people, the lived impact? And then finally, she says, well, how has this representation of the problem been produced, been disseminated, been defended by those who, I guess, have a vested interest in making this problem not contested? And the reason that she asks that question is so that people can potentially move on to the next step, which is to resist that formation of the problem, resist that kind of creation of a discourse which is politically expedient to the policymakers. And so we found this a really attractive way of looking at these national plans, particularly because, as you can sort of tell, there's a hint of the criticism, the friendly constructive criticism that's about to come from both sides of the border. And we found that Baki's framework was really useful for that. So what we're going to do now in our discussion for the rest of this episode is just to work through those questions. So if you're a music person, this will be of interest to you because it will unpack something that is dear to your heart. But if you're not a music person, this is like a walkthrough of what you can do with any policy document in any area of education or government policy or anything really. So hopefully you'll find this useful. Elizabeth is going to try to unpack for us now what the problem is represented to be by those English policymakers.
Great, thanks, Tom. We had many a discussion about this as we started talking about national plans together and comparing them across Wales and England. And I guess we were slightly surprised almost that actually when we sort of boiled down our thoughts, the thing that we established was actually the problem is music education. Simple as that.
We're a problem, folks.
We are a problem. It is a problem. And that is particularly evident because in neither England nor Wales will you find a national plan or two national plans for any other subject. There is no national plan for mathematics. There is no national plan for physical education. There is no national plan for religious education. There is no national plan for geography. It's just music. And that's only the national plans. Certainly in England, there's a whole sort of political ecosystem. You have documents such as the model music curriculum, the national curriculum, the first national plan, the second national plan, a whole heap of white papers and reviews and Ofsted triennial subject reports. They just don't exist for any other subjects in quite the same way. So if music education wasn't a problem, why would we need this plan? But clearly, it is. I think it's similar in Wales, don't you think?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think in Wales, the problem represented to the policymakers prior to the national plan was how to fix the problems with the music services. You know, that has gone on for probably, 25 years, prior to the national plan. And I mentioned earlier on that, to be fair to them, they have made giant steps forward in terms of creating a national music service for Wales. But in doing so, they've kind of created another problem. And that's conflating music education as a whole with the work of the music services, because all through the national plan, they talk about music education as one entity. And I don't think they mean to, but they really quite unhelpfully, by doing that, reduce the sort of idea of music education in Wales to learning an instrument and learning how to sing via the music services extracurricular provision. And it's just unfortunate that rarely does the plan seem to mention that music as a practical subject, learnt holistically, through performing, composing, appraising, through many different styles of music, through many different approaches to music learning and teaching, as part of that curriculum offer, it's already present and statutory for young people in their classroom contexts. It's barely mentioned. And it just seems really strange that policymakers have named it a national plan for music education and not considered all types of music education that is present in Wales.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it is true to say there were all sorts of problems with music service provision because obviously, when you divide the counties up into 22, you've got whatever the opposite of economies of scale are, that's what you've got going on there. And you've certainly got some geographical challenges. But it is strange given that, as you were both saying earlier on, Wales went with a really nice, simple option for the national curriculum, didn't get themselves in a tangle, went with performing, composing and praising, and have now sort of gone into a really weird, narrow place. It's very strange. Elizabeth, what presuppositions or assumptions have underlied the English national plan?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. This is one that I think, I struggled with in some regards because the fact that there is so much policy about music education suggests that the government are very pro-music education. They recognise the limitations of current provision and therefore they want to make it more equitable, more accessible, less of that kind of geographical lottery, both in England and Wales. And all three of us would be the first ones to say that everybody should be entitled to an equitable music education. I love this quotation from Ruth Wright, who used to work in Wales, in fact.
She did. She worked with us. Yeah, we were very lucky.
Yeah. She says, diverse, personally and culturally relevant music educations that develop the musical talents and abilities of all young people should be a human right.
Hooray. Well done, Ruth.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Ruth.
The quotation goes on, but anyway, there I go off on a tangent. And while we agree with that, and while the policies superficially agree with that, certainly in England, the kind of music education that supposedly every young person is entitled to is a very specific music education. Certainly in the second National Plan for Music Education, the image of music education is one that is bounded by the concept of excellence. This music education has to be excellent. It has to be outstanding. It has to meet the government standards of academic rigour. It has to be accountable to policies such as the model music curriculum. There are all of these new centres for excellence that are supposed to kind of set an example of best practice. And if the music education that's on offer does not meet these standards, then it almost doesn't count as music education. So while there is a sense of the importance of accessibility and equality, the scope of what music education might include has become very restricted. Tom?
Yes, well, I mean, without kind of, I don't want to sort of labour the whole, they conflated learning to play an instrument with the whole of music education, because we're going to keep coming back to that. But just keeping that in the back of your mind, let's have a look and see what sort of presuppositions or assumptions are sort of sitting behind that conflation. And actually, it's a really unfortunate one. It's one that we have fought against so much. And this is the assumption that the teaching of music in the classroom is somehow too difficult, too special, too elite, too technical, just too much all-round nasty hard work for a teacher, a qualified classroom teacher to do. And I mean, before I even go on with that, obviously, our opinion is that is not the case. We would never want any primary school teacher particularly. I mean, I'm saying primary because I've said this before, I take my hat off so much to primary teachers because they are expected to be generalists. They're expected to teach many, many subjects, including ones that they may have not enjoyed at school, not maybe felt they were that great at, or just had a terrible experience of. And music is often, sadly, one of those. And I have spent time in classrooms trying to unpick that fear in primary student teachers. Not all of them. Some of them are absolutely raring to go and teach music, but lots of them find it a really scary prospect. They don't get a lot of time on the programme to work on it. And so it is a bit of a problem. And it is unfortunate that if Welsh government, in putting their national plan for music out there and making this sort of slight confusion, if they have said that it's a great idea to have these first experiences, which Viv mentioned, which is basically, a member of the peripatetic music service coming in and doing maybe 10 weeks of whole class ukulele, whole class recorder, whatever it may be, P-bones, P-buzzes. Go look those up if you're not a musician.
I hear there's P-flute now.
P-flutes. There's no P-violas, I noticed. But if they're coming in to do that, well, first of all, with the greatest of respect to a peripatetic teacher, they probably don't have qualified teacher status. And from what I'm hearing on the grapevine, they're not getting a heck of a lot of pedagogy, professional learning before they're put in to do that. What the assumption is that they are more capable of teaching classroom music than a qualified classroom teacher who, particularly in case of primary, really knows those children, really knows that school and the context. And that is a very interesting assumption to make. The implication is that if you bring someone in and give them 10 weeks of whole class ukulele or whatever it is, well, first of all, that's going to be better than what a qualified teacher could do. And secondly, that is going to compensate for socioeconomic inequities, which are mentioned a lot in these plans, to give every child the opportunity to, do music education, that's going to compensate for that. They're going to come in, do 10 weeks and then go.
And also that's compensating for a music education that should be performing, composing and appraising. And as Elizabeth says, that just narrows down the experience of music making in the classroom. And I suppose it also kind of puts in children's heads that that's what music is.
Yeah, and which should be integrated and not a bolt-on, not done by somebody else who's not part of the school that comes in and does it once and then leaves. And it's interesting because you can go way back. There was one of those music service reports, I think, or one of those feasibility studies or something about the music service, which actually had the kind of paragraph in it that said something like one-off musical experiences are really attractive, particularly to primary head teachers, because basically you can get them in if you don't have a specialist music teacher on your staff. Well, okay, I get that there's going to be a bunch of people in primary that are not that keen on teaching music, but surely we should do something about that. Help them kind of feel confident rather than say, well, it's okay, we can just do a one-off and tick it off. Because like Elizabeth was saying about national plans and things over in England, we wouldn't do that with another subject. Anyway, I'm gonna get tranquilised gently over here and ask Elizabeth how this problem representation over in England came about.
I'm just getting distracted by the notion of a pea flute. Anyway, we'll park that.
That could be another podcast.
Yes. Oh, excellent! It could have live demonstrations, couldn't it? Yeah. So how has this problem representation come about? Well, I want to just outline two kind of political trends that have certainly had a significant influence in England, quite explicitly. But as our analysis found, we think they're potentially having an increasing influence in Wales as well. So the first is that of neoliberalism. Now, whenever I mention neoliberalism in my journal articles, I always get told by reviewers, you need to define this better. So here's my definition of neoliberalism for your benefit. Neoliberalism refers to the kind of political micromanagement and the accountability frameworks that pursue success in global markets of knowledge. So neoliberalism is about a kind of extreme individualized promotion of being economically efficient and successful in the global market. Now, neoliberalism is part of the reason why we have global measures of school achievement, such as the Programme for International Student Assessment, the PISA. It's also why we have programmes like, for example, in England, the English Baccalaureate, the EBAC, which ensures that you're taking the most sort of economically expedient subjects in your GCSEs.
So not music.
Not music. Music is not included in the EBAC. It's also why we have things like, these are all very English, but there you go. England's quite neoliberal, but Progress 8 scores and all these various different school rankings that mean that leadership teams, academy trusts, teachers, head teachers, even pupils have to meet these particular requirements. There's another trend, however, that's becoming increasingly prominent, especially in England, which is that of neoconservatism. Now, this is the political promotion and transmission of a fixed canon of historical, cultural, and social knowledge, which is perceived to be the best that has been thought and said. That's in air quotations, if you're listening. And that's, borrowing from Matthew Arnold. Now, neoconservatism means that somebody somewhere has decided what is the most worthwhile knowledge that we should be transmitting in our classrooms, and they are therefore passing it on to the next generation. Both of these trends are very evident in the National Plan for Music Education, particularly in the way in which it foregrounds elite and Western ways of music making. So, building on the national curriculum and the model music curriculum, the National Plan for Music Education promotes this idea that the best music is that of the Western art music canon, and that the progression pathways that young musicians follow are most likely and most able to be those which pursue that particular notion of excellence. So you can go to a specialist music school where you will learn to play the oboe to a professional standard. You're unlikely to be supported in your expert, enculturated drum kit playing, because that is not quite in the same realm as Western art musics. How does this, what similarities does this share in Wales? I think we found more than we expected.
I was just speculating on the P-oboe or the pobo.
Oh dear.
I mean, actually,
sorry.
The Welsh government, it gets many critiques, doesn't it? But neoliberal and neoconservative probably isn't usually one of them.
No, I mean, I think we've, in the past, we've been through kind of phases of that. But I think at the moment in Wales, I don't know whether, Tom, you think it's fair to say that Wales is trying to take a different direction more broadly in its worldview of education, and it is trying to adopt a more progressive approach. And we can see that in the philosophies and the aspirations, around curriculum for Wales. But when we think about music and music education, and when we think about this conflation of the music service provision and music education as a whole in Wales, and this idea in the National Plan for Music Education, the Welsh plan, that music education is all about learning to play an instrument and learning to sing. Unfortunately, it does seem to point towards a preference, and actually the policies before that as well have done the same thing. It does seem to point to a preference that the policymakers are kind of privileging a more traditional view of music education where, as Elizabeth says, elite Western modes of music making are dominant. And despite the national plan's, sort of emphasis on and its aspiration towards access and equality, as Elizabeth said earlier on, that's not to be doubted. It's clear that that's what they're trying to do, but they're doing it in a very narrow framing of music education, around, very formal, traditional, Western-influenced kind of approaches to music education. And I suppose the starting point for that, not that I want to go back to hitting the right note in 2018, but I'm going to.
You're going to hit the right note again.
Yeah, I'm going to hit that note. The policy document hitting the right note in 2018 really kind of foregrounded this neoconservative preference towards music education. First of all, the report draws from a really exclusive sample of influential musicians and ensembles, but they all come from a Western classical background. We've got conductors like Owen Arwell Hughes and Tim Rhys-Evans. They consulted with organisations such as T Cerdd and National Arts Wales, who look after all the elite national youth groups like the National Youth Orchestra Wales, National Brass Band of Wales, etc. And it was interesting that conspicuous by their absence were musicians from other genres. They could have, especially in Wales, they could have spoken to folk musicians or musicians from a pop and rock background, but no, they were absent. As were musicians who practiced forms of music other than performance. So I don't think, Tom, there were any composers there, or maybe, musicians who practiced. It was very predominantly kind of performing-based musicians, I think.
And we did go through the individual evidence pieces,
did,
didn't we? And
we
found
did.
A massive absence in there.
Yeah, and the biggest absence of all was schools and school music teachers.
Which was weird.
And if the point and the purpose of the report was an analysis of music education in Wales, then surely they had as much right to be at the table than the great and good of music making in Wales. Now, to be fair to the national plan, the one that was published, the one that we're talking about, the one that was published in 2022, there was quite considerable consultation with stakeholders, with responsibility for music education. I think schools were involved, community groups were involved that represented different forms and genres of music. And to its credit, for the first time ever, there was a focus group made up of music educators from higher education, which is a strange thing because we're always left out in the cold, aren't we? But they did consult with us, and I went along and I was very pleased to take part. And I did bring up quite a few of the things that we were talking about today, things like why is the national plan called a plan for music education when it's clearly about the music services? Why is it only about formal ways of performing and not a wider framing of music education? But the problem with that meeting was that I was kind of a lone voice. And unfortunately, the meeting was dominated by colleagues who came from elite institutions like Cardiff University, Welsh College, those very ones who tend to privilege Western classical music and align themselves with that narrow framing of music education. So all credit to the plan for trying to consult widely. But this conflation of music education and the role of the music services really got in the way of that. And that kind of started this whole kind of ball of the ball rolling, didn't it, Tom?
Yeah, I think the hitting the right note people would probably say to us, we were just writing about the music services. What are you on about? This was a music service report. But if you're going to if you're going to blow the language up and start talking about music education, that is a loose use of language because the report is, fair enough, not about anything other than the music services. But if it's not about anything other than the music services, don't say that it's about something bigger than it is, because then you cause a problem.
Yeah. That's it. And that has unfortunately snowballed now in the last kind of, where are we now? 2025, we're talking 7 years.
Yeah.
That loose language has been used in policies.
It's been recycled in the national plan, hasn't it? They didn't question it. They sort of just adopted it.
That's right. And it's confusing and frustrating.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
And that, I mean, Viv's already touched on those who've been silenced by that particular conceptualization in the national plan. Those, musicians making music in other genres, in other modes like composing and use of digital music technologies. They're completely absent. And the same is the case in the English National Plan. Nick Gibb, who was the Secretary of State for Education at the time, sort of wrote the foreword describing his own experience of singing as a boy chorister, singing Allegri's Miserere, and the sort of life-changing impact that had for him. And yet, very few of the pupils in our classrooms or the pupils using our music services will ever have that experience or could ever have that experience. And that's not to say that they are not being educated in music. But what these plans do, both of them, is silence the kinds of ways that many young people do engage with music on an everyday basis, whether that's the music that they stream or the bands that they listen to, the time that they spend with their friends making music, that classic playing in your garage band, or whether that's the digital on your tablet garage band with a capital G and a capital B. Other software is available. None of those ways of music making are accounted for, even though music education research suggests that those are the ways of music making that are most culturally and socially relevant to young people, and therefore have the most potential to engage them in a meaningful way and equip them for potentially lifelong music making. I don't know if you want to add.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was going to say in terms of the sort of silencing and things like that, this is where both countries' kind of political bigwigs kind of do a similar thing, which is both countries have a sort of national psyche thing about a sort of long, glorious folk tradition of music, don't they? I mean, I've always been fascinated by the English sort of psyche hang-up thing about a sort of, mythical rural past and all that sort of thing. And you've got it in Wales as well. I mean, you've got it even more in Wales because, we actually, it gets quite annoying sometimes when people start trotting out the whole land of song thing, particularly when they don't necessarily think stuff through, because over here, we also have our political actors really sort of, getting on that bandwagon of a great, glorious musical tradition going back hundreds of years, some of which is a little bit made up, really, although I don't want to geek out about that. But both political kind of groups in England and Wales then immediately personalise it by talking about their own very elite, very Western classical kind of backgrounds, and in the process manage to silence not only classroom music teachers, as Viv has said, but also a whole kind of participatory, informal, unregulated type of music making, which is much more potentially equitable, meaningful, healthy, accessible, all of those things. They promptly forget about them because they draw on their own elite experiences. And that is just really interesting, isn't it? And it leads to certain decisions and certain choices which have some unintended consequences.
Yeah, the lived effects or the discursive effects. In England, I think this is really pronounced. And anyone who is sort of has followed the response of music hubs and music services since the release of the National Plan will be aware of just how complicated this has made life for educators. I did a little AI-assisted analysis of this document, basically because I didn't want to count the words manually. So in the English National Plan, which has about 27,000 words, the phrase high quality appears once in every 563 words. That's a lot of times.
It's very high quality. It's a lot of quality.
Very high quality. Talent is 1 in every 628. Excellent comes 1 in every 844 words. The word ambitious, which only appeared once in the 2011 plan, now appears 25 times. So we see this whole kind of new discursive environment where everything about music education has to be high quality, excellent. It's about the talented musicians. It has to be ambitious. You should note that at no point in the policy is high quality or excellent or any of those words defined. They never define what they mean by that.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because everyone's up for things being great, but it's a certain type of great and a certain type of high quality, isn't it? Which is quite narrow.
Yeah, and especially when you sort of partner that with, there are all kinds of new organisational structures. I've already talked about the reduction in the number of music hubs because they become music hub lead organisations, but we also have lead schools, we have centres for excellence, we have music hub partnerships, we have music development plans, and they're at like a school music development plan and hub music development plan levels. It's a nightmare to negotiate, and we've already seen hubs having to apply for competitive pots of funding to become those lead organisations, to be able to have control over the funding that they're offered and what they spend it on. But it's become very complicated and has even more of those layers, those neoliberal layers of accountability. You have to match this example of best practice. You have to be accountable to this lead organisation. You have to fulfil this piece of policy. It's a bit different in Wales.
Yeah, I think when we think about the lived effects, of the national plan in Wales, we've got to acknowledge that there have been some plus points. And I've mentioned before about in terms of music service provision, there's definitely more consistency. I see more collaboration across Wales, within the music services. Funding seems to be much better managed than it was before. I see music services branching out from their more traditional way of teaching in terms of just going in and teaching individuals or small groups, So I think, there are some real positives coming out of the plan, but because of this conflation, I'm going back to this conflation again, because that's the nub of it really, isn't it? Because of this conflation and them calling it a national plan for music education, but them having a narrow framing of what that actually is. The lived effects are much of the things that we've talked about already. I mean, first of all, this sort of privileging of Western classical style, of pedagogic delivery. The music services, for all their expansion in terms of, the new things they're trying to do, they still teach in a very traditional, formal, teacher-led, kind of pedagogic style. And as Tom says, they overlook that sort of everyday, informal, non-formal ways of learning music, of learning to be a musician. And, as you say, Elizabeth, that are most commonly experienced by those young people, outside of school or outside of the practice room or the rehearsal room. I've said before about this narrow framing of music education within the plan as being solely about learning an instrument or learning to sing, and it not acknowledging that sort of wider remit of music education in Wales, and the fact that, if we're going to talk about music education in Wales, then there is such a thing as composing. There is such a thing as appraising. And again, we go back to this sort of narrow framing of what they constitute music education to be within the plan. And then I think thirdly, whilst there are some peripatetic music teachers who go into schools to deliver schemes like First Experiences, they are qualified teachers themselves, or they maybe have years of experience and have honed their craft and have, become quite skilled at it. Like with all teaching, there's going to be variability there. There's bound to be, and I think that means that other peripatetic teachers, excellent musicians as they are, they're not going to have the same pedagogic training, as primary teachers, or the same experience as those who've done it for a long time and have kind of honed their craft at it. So because of that, they won't have the same understanding of pedagogy, of curriculum design, of the learners themselves. But they're going in to replace classroom teachers in the teaching of music. And actually, in doing so, they're using quite variable resources as well. So just going back to the lived experiences, I think the lived experiences for some primary teachers is that they're not getting a chance to understand and experience the teaching of a holistic music curriculum, many aspects of which I think they'd be quite capable of teaching because they would have learnt music informally themselves over the years and would be really best placed to go in and use those approaches in the classroom. But they're not getting those experiences to widen, their sort of thinking and their practice in a holistic music curriculum because these peripatetists are going in and replacing them. And I think it's this narrow framing of music education that the plan presents, i.e. learning to play an instrument, learning to sing, privileging performing over other elements of the curriculum. It's these things that perpetuate the myth for primary teachers that they've not got the skill to teach music, very much like the work that you and Gary have done in your research. OK, they may not be music specialists, but what they are is expert pedagogues. If out in the profession, if there's anybody out there who are really excellent and expert when you think about teaching and learning, it's got to be primary teachers.
Yeah.
It's got to be.
And probably more expert at producing some sort of learning experience that's genuinely holistic, participatory, joyful, and life-enhancing for the pupils that they know really, really well than a professional musician from outside,
Absolutely.
I would argue.
Yeah.
So I think the plan does run the risk, really, of kind of reinforcing those negative views that music is too specialist to teach. And, as we've said a number of times, what the plan should and could do is support those teachers, with their expert pedagogy knowledge, support those teachers to think about that within a sort of a music remit.
Yeah, I think the final question comes on to sort of the way that the problems represented in these plans have been disseminated. And I think in England we see something similar to that, where in Wales you've got almost the de-skilling of primary teachers. And in England it's been framed slightly differently. But this kind of sudden explosion of government-approved resources for teaching music has had quite a similar effect, I think. Here there's this arose during COVID-19, but it's stuck around basically. It's called the Oak Academy, which is effectively the government call it an arm's length curriculum body. And some mysterious curriculum designers write schemes of work that align with the national curriculum. And in the case of music, it aligns with the model music curriculum and the National Plan for Music Education. And nominally, the aim of it is to reduce teachers' workload so that you can log on and anyone can log on. It's all free to access. You can log on and download a unit of work complete with worksheets, PowerPoints, you name it, it's there. And while there is something really valuable about addressing teachers' workload, and we know that burnout and stress and mental health problems are a big issue for teachers, there's also this kind of this new structure that effectively says if you want to teach music well in such a way that it is government approved and that you will do well in your school inspections, then look, here's our body of material. And actually teachers are trained to write those materials, to design those materials for those pupils. And there's a sense in which, well, they're available, so I probably ought to use them, and therefore I don't have autonomy to we've got to do it myself.
We've got a similar thing in Wales, haven't we, Tom? With the National Plan has produced a resource bank, a digital resource bank called Charanga, which I believe is from England originally, Elizabeth, isn't it? And I look at Tiranga and I see some good stuff sometimes, stuff that has been written bespokely for Wales, then but it's really variable, isn't it? There's some other stuff on there and it seems to be retrofitted, from England into Wales, and somebody's kind of stuck a couple of lines on, to link it to the national curriculum here in Wales, curriculum for Wales. But I suppose what really worries me is this whole thing about it's not in the spirit of Curriculum for Wales that we take something off the shelf. Curriculum for Wales was all about stopping that practice of off-the-shelf resources. And here we've got a resource that is that's variable quality, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of thinking about the England thing for a minute. It is really interesting that the English National Curriculum for Music is actually, the statutory bit is actually really quite short, isn't it? There's not a whole lot in it.
Yeah, it's great.
But you've got a model music curriculum, non-statutory, but like you're kind of implying there, no one probably ever got sacked for following the model music curriculum. Similarly, Oak Academy, probably nobody ever got sacked for using their stuff, whereas being innovative, maybe you feel you're taking a risk. I mean, you're right, Viv. I mean, the whole problem, I mean, at the risk of banging on about it, is that in terms of how you disseminate your view, your vision of what music education is, you're basically doing it with money and stuff, aren't you? And that's definitely the case over here in Wales, which is that if you reduce all the sort of variety and all the richness of music education to learning to play an instrument, you are going to give all your money and stuff to the people who are helping people learn to play an instrument. And, best of luck to the music services, who were probably incredibly chuffed that all the money for music education headed off in the direction of the music services and was used to buy instruments and was used to subscribe to a digital resource, which is a load of stuff. What was it not used for? It was not used. Well, I mean, nobody came up here and asked if we could kind of, fill in those gaps in music pedagogy, provision for primary teachers, but also for secondary drama teachers and secondary art teachers who might now be crossing over a bit into music. Nobody came and sort of spent any of that money on professional learning or kind of understanding of what the subject is, or any of that sort of stuff for teachers in the classroom who are best placed to reach every single child.
And I think, on that point of professional learning, I see some music services around Wales doing a pretty good job of bringing experienced classroom teachers in to help to provide professional learning, both for peripatetic teachers and then for classroom teachers, as you say, when those peripatetic teachers leave after 10 weeks, for the classroom teacher. But it's, I've talked about consistency and the fact that the national plan has improved consistency in some aspects. What it's not done yet is made that aspect of it consistent, and there is real variability out there where some music services are doing a pretty good job of professional learning and others are just left out in the cold.
Yeah, I'm certainly aware of people who are doing first experiences, and they've told me, and I'm not going to name which music services they're involved with, but they're telling me that they're going into classrooms and they have had no training. I would not name music service names there. I guess the other problem we've got over here in Wales as well is that this vision is the only game in town, perhaps more than it is over in England. And what I mean by that is we don't have a Welsh Music Subject Association. We've got the same music subject associations as England, and they've been very busy doing, a very, very good job of fighting the good fight for music over in England. I mean, I'm hearing now that the dreaded EBAC that you mentioned is actually potentially going to go. That's in the, being suggested in the news by the ISM and people like that. They're looking, I think Labour have said that they want to broaden the curriculum to include arts, so that sort of thing, and there's one of the subject associations very much claiming victory over in England. But certainly if you speak to them, and no huge criticism here, but you speak to them, they're less aware of the issues in Wales, which are different, very, very different. And also, we did have regional consortia who were there to help schools and support schools, and now those are sort of on the way out. And so all the sort of alternative sources of voices, other than us kind of ranting here in this studio, are very much not around in Wales now. And so this, it sounds like we're getting terribly hung up about a loose use of language, several years ago. But actually, when that stuff happens, there's not a whole lot of guardrails over here to stop the unintended consequences from getting quite big.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was speaking to one head of music, secondary head of music, and I was asking about the national plan and, how it's, being disseminated and, facilitating her work. And, this is just an example of the variability. It was literally tumbleweed. Yeah. There was nothing. And as you say, the consortia now are, it looks like we're in transition with their work. And, there's this potential to be huge gaps.
Yeah.
And I've seen that, myself, just in literally sort of 2 areas of Wales.
Yeah, and I mean, just to give sort of 2 examples of things I've seen, if I'm basically kind of making the assertion that all the money's heading off elsewhere, well, here's a couple of examples. There are very few people training to be secondary music teachers in Wales. Very few. And we do have shortage subject bursaries. And music is supposedly not a shortage subject, and yet it's got extremely low numbers. But here's the really interesting one. I mean, Welsh Government are putting money out there to organisations to create things. They've sort of said, don't make it stuff, make it something more professional learning, to support curriculum for Wales, different areas of curriculum for Wales that they've identified as priority subjects, like literacy and numeracy, for example. Music is a priority subject for support in curriculum for Wales. But when I went and had a little sniff around, they are not accepting any bids for that money which focuses on music. They basically say on the web page, well, we don't need anything. It's a priority subject, but we've already got something in place. And of course, what did I do? I went and I asked an insider. I said, is that the national plan for music? They're saying, when they say we don't need anyone else supporting curriculum for Wales because we've got something, is that national plan? And that person said yes.
Yeah, it is. And that's an issue, isn't it?
That's a problem, because the national plan is supporting music services. And, fine, great and brilliant. Yeah. But that conflation is still going on because they think they've got curriculum for Wales music sorted. And,
if the national plan going forward, if they are going to be the sort of go-to place for music education in Wales, who is going to broaden their perception of music education? If it is just the music service provision, who is running it, who is there who is going to broaden that perception? What's going to happen? How is that going to be supported?
Well, I would say your email address is publicly available, Vic. Well, having sort of picked it apart a little bit following Carol Backey's framework, I said at the start that working through those questions, Carol Backey is encouraging us to potentially look at what the alternatives could be. So, Elizabeth, you dug through the sort of literature, found a well-known giant of music education, the mighty Keith Swanwick, who might be pointing us towards some potential alternatives, or what Backey would call resistance.
Yes, thank you. So Keith Swanwick, very well-known music educator, previous professor at Institute of Education at University College London. In around 2008, he coined this notion of the good enough music teacher.
Which sounds terrible, doesn't it?
It sounds terrible. And yet, so maybe we don't want to run into further issues of loose terminology.
So now you're going to define it for us.
So now I'm going to define it, indeed. But I guess what really resonated with us about this concept was its movement away from this canonic notion of Western art music excellence, and the idea that there are so many other ways and forms and modes of music making that are good enough. And we're not talking about just about towing the line. We're talking like they are good. They are really, really good. They just don't have to meet any kind of politician's notion of excellence. So the way that Swanwick sort of defines the good enough music teacher is as a music teacher who is effectively empowered not to completely take the reins themselves, not to say, oh, well, I've got to meet this expectation, implement this particular digital resource, mark my students' work in such and such a way, but one who is sufficiently equipped to give that autonomy back to their pupils, which means sometimes taking that more kind of hands-off facilitatory role in which pupils are allowed to start to explore and experiment with their musical learning. So they might do something that is... I've had a wonderful example that a teacher recounted to me at some stage about some pupils who wanted to study grime music, not grime, the research group, grime music. And in doing so, fortunately, they found an old school drum kit, and they were recording their music with their recording device inside the bass drum that they'd taken apart. So they were effectively creating their own distortion. And that's just and the teacher, thankfully, because they hadn't actually wrecked any school equipment, was able to go in and say, this is exactly the kind of exploratory, experimental attitude that real musicians, in this instance, grime musicians, take towards their music. And so by having that hands-off kind of good enough, the poor teacher was a bit like, I don't know anything about grime. I watched a documentary about it and then just let them get on with it. And actually, that facilitated so much more engagement, interest, high-quality music making, just not in such a way that is perhaps defined by these plans. So what we really, I guess, wanted to sort of leave ourselves and anybody reading or listening to our discussions with is this idea of teachers who are able to open up potential spaces for perhaps unexpected music making that exceed the kinds of hierarchical triangles of progression whereby pupils progress from first experiences through to small group instrumental lessons through to National Youth Orchestra of Wales or England. Actually, we want pupils to be going out in all kinds of different directions, making music in ways that they find socially relevant and culturally resonant, and to use that as the basis for the kinds of music making that are going on both in classrooms and in music services.
And that feels much more in keeping with curriculum for Wales than what we've got with this plan, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking when you were talking about sort of standing back and letting pupils experiment, it's kind of maybe what the national plan needs to do for... We've talked about primary teachers as, the sort of, maybe if they did that a little bit for primary teachers, rather than just say, you're scared of doing it, so I'm going to come in and do it for you, giving them that sort of supportive space, that potential place that you're talking about for young people, that could be the same for teachers, giving them this place, this supportive space to experiment, to just find a way through, rather than just sort of back off completely. Give them, that space to develop.
Yeah, and actually we've talked a lot about the sort of baggage that comes around the subject in the primary sector. We've talked less about the baggage around the subject in the secondary age phase, which is that actually this Western classical elitist kind of framing of the subject is very frequently what secondary music teachers have come through in their own education. Yeah. And so actually the National Plan for Music Education doesn't need to be pushing anybody even further into that happy place. Much more of that sort of experimental, perhaps went to conservatoire, but now I'm finding out about grime sort of aspects.
It was really interesting. Tom and I went to visit Lucy Green, didn't we, a few months ago? And we were telling her...
Name-checking every mighty professor, aren't we?
I was just reminded of it. And we were telling her about the national plan, and she was sort of saying, "Oh, well, have you spoken to Musical Futures?" And and she was quite surprised, I suppose, that there wasn't this sort of much broader sort of church around the national plan. But I mean, as you say, Tom, it is just this very narrow framing, isn't it?
Yeah. definitely. We're name-checking all the professors. I mean, Lucy Green, practically Wales England board runs through a kitchen practically, doesn't it? So she can look at both. Well, I mean, that's been a bit of a geek fest for us, but hopefully, even if you're not a music person, you can see that sort of step-by-step going through a government policy and how much stuff comes out if you really think about it. And in the spirit of that, we're going to do our short slots are something interesting, something to try. I mean, I'll just quickly mention something interesting because Elizabeth mentioned grime, which is a musical style, but it's also the name of a research group here at Cardiff Met, the Group for Research in Music Education, of which we're all proud members, but so are various other people as well. And I suppose just for something interesting, we would encourage listeners to go and find some of the outpourings of grime. I mean, there's this piece of work which is published open access in Arts Education Policy Review. So if you actually want to read what we wrote about this, you can go and find the article, which has a long and involved title. The title of this article is A National Plan for Music Education, a comparative what's the problem represented to be analysis across England and Wales. We need to work on our titles, I think. But that is out there. And we're very much hoping that by the time this hits your ears, we may also have a comparison or a sort of historical comparison of GCSE music in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which we've done along with our colleague, another professor, Gary Beecham. And we hope that will be out there. So something interesting, or we certainly hope it's interesting, we find it interesting, is some of the research outputs there, which maybe will give some food for thought. And if you are out there studying music education in a research capacity, perhaps you're doing the National MA, the National ED here in Wales, or perhaps you're studying over in England for a research-based course, either as a music teacher in the classroom or a music educationalist, do get in touch with us over here, because we are interested in supporting anybody who's digging into a subject that perhaps, as we've maybe argued in this episode, could do with a few more people thinking a little bit more deeply about the subject. And something to try. Elizabeth, you were the one that brought her to us, so you can have this one.
Yeah, so I first came across Carol Backey's work in policy analysis at the Research in Music Education conference in 2023, I think, where she actually gave a kind of introductory analysis analysing the English National Plan. You can find that online very easily. But we would highly recommend either you read some of her work, which is effectively in the kind of post-structural policy analysis domain, if you are not familiar with it. And why not try going through some of those steps with a policy that has impacted you? That could be something like the national plan, something like the national curriculum. If you're in a different subject, why not try out your curriculum? But it could also be institutional policies. What about your school's homework policy? It's behaviour policy. It's equality and diversity policy. It's uniform policy. You name it. What are the problems it's representing? How does it attempt to solve them? And are they really problems in the first place? What are the problems that are being silenced by that particular representation?
Yeah, we've really had fun with this, haven't we, Viv?
Yeah, we have. Well, thank you to Elizabeth for introducing it to us.
Yeah.
It's been good fun.
It's been great. Yeah. And yes, post-structural policy analysis may not sound like it's going to be fun, but as you hopefully heard, if you've stuck this through to the end, it really does uncover a multitude of interesting things. Thank you to Dr. Elizabeth MacGregor, who's joined us from Oxford today. Thank you.
And Walnut.
And to Walnut, who was very well behaved.
He was a good boy.
He's shifted slightly in his team.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dr. Viv John, sitting next to me
It's a
here
pleasure.
in the studio. Yeah, it's been fun again. And as ever, we will be back with you in 2 weeks' time. You've You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by me, Tom Breeze. The special guests this episode were Dr. Viv John from here at Cardiff Met and Dr. Elizabeth MacGregor from the University of Leeds. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blanford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. Technical support from Peter Lamburn and the studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.